Train the muscles, not the joints.
Welcome back to Natural Glam Bodybuilding Mountain. And today I'm going to share some more stories about growing up in the 80s. Now, I don't even know why this would be interesting to you guys, but a couple of you guys have asked me about stories that I have from growing up in the 80s, or what my experiences were. And there's a few experiences that I think would be kind of worth sharing with you that might be interesting, might help you reminisce if you're my age or you're in your 40s or whatever. And then those of you who are younger might realize how much of a bubble wrap society you live in now compared to the society I grew up in. And honestly, I think my version was better. So I think in the 80s, as much as there might be a good and bad for any sort of era, right? There was a certain amount of accountability that took place. A certain amount of, you get punched in the face if you do something wrong. Like there's a lot of guys that talk shit on the internet, or they say a lot of stuff, even in person sometimes. But there was almost like a certain amount of allowable punchability that happened in the 80s that really kept people a little bit more humble, right? There's no way that you could get away with saying whatever you wanted, whenever you want it, without having to have a physical sort of confrontation at some point. You know, if you kept on chirping, something would have happened, right? Where now I find, depending on the neighborhood you grew up in, now it's almost like, the PTA will get behind, things and protect little Johnny, even though Johnny's been harassing somebody for 2 or 3 years and saying horrendous stuff, right? And then Johnny finally gets punched, and then everybody's like, oh, the violence of it all, poor Johnny, right? So that didn't really happen. And I don't know, I find it, I'm not saying I advocate, just a horrible war zone for kids to live in, but the law of cause and effect, if you can get them to learn this lesson in a small level first, then when the bigger lessons come, they're not so shocked, right? They're not so surprised, right? Because they're like, wow, I haven't been protected my whole life quite so much. So, I remember this is like one of the first days my brother and I, because we moved from the east side of the country, because we grew up in Newfoundland, as far as that's where we were born. And then when we were 5 years old, we had to move to the other side of the country because my dad became a policeman. And of course, the police, the national police, the RCMP, they're basically like the FBI, I guess you could say. But they're basically the dominant police force in most provinces in Canada. So the RCMP sent my dad to Vancouver, the opposite side of the country. So we had to leave all our relatives, all our friends, all our cousins, everything. And it was almost like being plopped in the middle of a new society, because when you're 5 years old, you really heavily identify with all of your safety net, which is your relatives, right? So some of you guys could probably relate if you moved a lot as a kid or whatever, but I got plopped into this school, and I came from a place where I felt very safe, nurtured. There was a lot of kids that liked me. I had 2 girlfriends, even in grade 1. It was like, whatever that means when you're in grade 1, right? But the bottom line is I had 2 girlfriends, and I had some experiences. Funny enough, I had a guy that lived in the trailer park behind my trailer park that I grew up in, up until that point. His name was also Jason Gallant. And one day I asked him to come out and play, and he kicked me in the nuts just because he thought that would be a good way to say no. So I had these experiences a little bit. So maybe I should have taken this as a premonition of what was waiting for me when I moved to the west side of the country. Because, the Newfoundland was pretty good because I had all this buffer, and I had a lot of friends and people to play with. But I did have a couple of little, incidences where I got hit with a rock, or, somebody threw a rock at me, hit me in the head and caused me to bleed just for being me, And then another one, I got kicked in the nards. And I got ran over by a big dog because there was this guy that had a big dog. And that's the other thing. Big dogs roamed the neighborhoods in the late 70s and early 80s. Big dogs just roamed. It's almost like they were hunting. Like, lions on the savannah, they were just basically hunting for poor children to get in the way. And you didn't know what was going to happen because some of them were pretty friendly, but then the odd one was a little bit rougher than the other ones, And it's almost like these dogs had free rein because they weren't really controlled that much. The owners had just let them run free. So, you had to become dog savvy too. And you learned to recognize some dogs were more vicious than others, and you had to make sure that you kept your hands to yourself because you don't know if you're going to get your hand back. So that was the other thing. Like, it's a miracle that we survived, but basically that was a normal thing. When I was walking home from school, or if I was wandering around my neighborhood, I had to be careful about, you know, what dog I interacted with. I mean, it was common if you were riding your bike, all of a sudden a dog to come running out and chase you on the bike, and you didn't know if he was going to get your shoes or not or what. So anyway, that said, you know, I mean, I think it made us stronger, you know, because only the strong survive. But anyway, when I moved to Vancouver, and like I said, we were only 5 years old, and we went to this one school, and we were only at this one school for a month before we moved more to a permanent address. Well, my dad was, because we were living in a hotel, and my dad had to find a house to rent. And the first day on the playground, the first day, a kid just grabbed me, put me in a headlock and threw me down to the ground, and he said, "Hey, let's wrestle," you know, and I cut my nose all over his zipper because he had one of those winter jackets, and the rough zipper just cut my nose up. And I was like, wow, this is different. This is not the way I was growing up before. Like, wrestling, what is that? Like, I didn't even know what that was. You know, I'd heard of boxing and stuff, but never really heard of wrestling. But for the kids in the schools, in elementary school out here, it was almost like a way of life. Like, there wasn't a lunch hour or a recess that I didn't spend wrestling, trying to assert dominance with another kid in the class to see who was stronger, who was faster, who was better. You know, there was always this competition thing going on, right? And I was a smaller kid, but yeah, I mean, I'd always be coming home with like stains all over my pants, like green grass stains, or, you know, a shirt torn out. I remember one time I got in a wrestling match with some kid, and my ear got torn. Like, it torn off a little bit, and it basically had to fucking press it back to my head to make sure that it stayed attached, right? So it's like, you know, so it was pretty fucking rough, right? But that was the way we grew up, and it was fun. Like, it was kind of like very much like going to the gym and that sort of thing. But one thing I learned about kids was that you couldn't trust them. And that was something that my brother and I were very naive with when we first came to this side of the country. Because once again, we were bubble wrapped a bit, I guess. I guess we had a nice family around us or whatever. But when we came out here, I realized, oh, you can't trust these fucking kids. Like, a lot of them were lying about where they lived. That they say, oh, I live in that mansion over there, and then I find out they didn't live there. And then and other kids would be like, you know, close your eyes and open your mouth. You get a big surprise. And then I remember watching my brother, and I'm like, don't do it, man, don't do it. And my brother closed his eyes, and he opened his mouth, and then this fucking kid, David Biskey, put a worm in his mouth. So I still remember asking Jamie, what did it taste like? And he goes, like plastic bags. That's what he said. So it was funny, right? So we learned very quickly not to trust people, and it's like you could trust in the right circumstances, but not outright. You know, it had to be earned. So that was like one of the lessons I learned at an early age, and I started to learn this. And I mean, I remember also this psychopath, Clifford Olson, was going around picking up kids and killing them. And it was happening where I lived in Mission, Maple Ridge, like the BC area. There was this psychopath going around doing this. And he was like really famous. He was all over the news and everything. I think he just died about 5 or 8 years ago in prison, actually. And I remember somebody stopping a car one time and trying to offer me money to get in. And just, hey kid, do you want to get in the car, whatever? And I'm like, no, and I ran for it, right? And had nightmares for a long time. But that shit happened too, you know? You had to watch out, and that's when the big stranger danger and block watch and stuff really started to come out, as far as there were these different sort of scenarios where you learned that there was such thing as danger, and then there was such thing as you know, safety, right? And you had to kind of discern that. So these things all were going on at the same time. And it's not like that was happening in a very big way. It's not like, you know, everything was dangerous. Because right now, I mean, one little incident happens and then, you know, the entire world shuts down. That's what people do now. You know, these kids and parents or whatever, and government, like, for your own safety, and that's it. You're not allowed to do anything. But back then, there was this plus side of it where you got to learn how to deal with people, how to deal with enemy and ally, and how to come to understanding as well through conflict with people. And through this allowing of these relationships to happen, wisdom happened. You know, there was a certain practicality to life that happened, and you started to realize that, hey, there was such thing as it being okay to have a conflict, and then maybe it was going to be okay later on. Like, and at the same time, sometimes a tiny bit of danger adds adventure to your life, right? There was this adventure. like most days when I would come home from school when I was grade 2, grade 3, grade 4, I would just be perpetually out the door on the BMX bike right away, doing jumps, going through mud puddles and stuff, sometimes going to a friend's house and playing guns and arguing about who shot who with the wooden gun, right? You know, and we're playing hide and seek and stuff. And we'd be going into the forest as well, and there was these trails that were close to the house. And you'd be making forts in there, always like making different tree forts, making, you know, boats out of rafts and stuff and putting them in ponds full of frogs and stuff and floating across. It was like a perpetual Goonies adventure, which is why the arcade unit in the background, you know, it's got Goonies on it, because Goonies was a movie that really showcased this kind of life that kids in the 80s lived, as much as, you know, they did the movie sort of magic around it and made it a little bit exaggerated. But there was this adventure or this exploratory process that kids went through. They explored stories together. They would create stories and sometimes make up games, you know, and work outside with this game, like say hide and seek, but then there was like a Star Wars theme to it, right? Where it was the Imperials hunting the rebels or something. So I remember also lawn darts, right? I don't know who invented lawn darts, but those things were fun to play with. I mean, they were like they were like a trap for kids, because lawn darts were so fun to throw, but there was always some kid that got lawn darted. And that would be it, right? Lawn darts would be taken away, you know, thrown in the garbage or whatever. But there was always some kid that was the victim of the lawn dart catastrophe, right? I remember this kid, Mike Hoffer. I moved to this new school in grade 5 with my brother, and Mike Hoffer was one of the popular kids in grade 5, you know, because my brother and I were always on the outskirts of popularity because we were twins, so nobody knew us. They were like, oh, they're both the same guy, whatever. So it's almost like we got isolated a lot. Like there was a lot of that not fitting into the popular circle, right? But anyway, Mike was a nice kid. He wasn't a bad kid. He was a soccer player and stuff. But anyway, he invited us to his birthday party. So that was nice. So we went to his birthday and everything was going good at McDonald's. You know, we had some McDonald's Happy Meals, all this stuff. Then we left there. We went back to his house. And of course, kids start playing games in the backyard. And everything had to do with activity. Games always had to do with activity or sports in the 80s. That's a lot of what was going on. And there was some video games, yeah, but a lot of times video games were at the arcade, and the video games you could play at home were still good, but they weren't the same as the arcade. So inevitably, physical activity was the main priority. So we're outside, and of course, some kid gets the lawn darts out, and they're like, oh yeah, let's play a game of lawn darts. But eventually, you know, it's just a natural sort of thing that kids do. They're saying, okay, what else can we do with the lawn darts? You know, how high can I throw this lawn dart? Like, how much height can I get out of this puppy? So sure enough, a kid throws a lawn dart straight up, and then the lawn dart comes straight down, and poor Mike, poor Mike, the birthday boy, is just standing there, not even realizing what's going on. I think he was having a conversation with somebody else, and the lawn dart just dunk right. Oh shit! Oh man, it was horrible at the time, but right now thinking back, thinking back, it was so funny because it was like, you know, just the worst thing that can happen on a kid's birthday. So off to the hospital he goes to make sure he didn't crack his skull. There's stitches and goes back. And I mean, the party keeps going, right? So anyway, that's kind of the way it was in the 80s, right? There was always like some, you know, there was a threat of disaster, and then there was also the promise of adventure. So you had to really be smart, right? And if you were stupid enough to be around the worst people, the friends, okay, this is the thing. If you're around the wrong friends, you got lawn darted, you know, some shit would happen to you. So this continues, okay? This lesson continues. I remember this one kid who became the worst bully ever, this kid in high school. This guy he actually had a nice personality, which was what was the weirdest thing about him. He didn't brand himself very well. You know what I mean? Most bullies would say, okay, they're a bad person or whatever. But this guy was kind of likable, but at the same time, he just loved torturing people. And what made it worse is that he was built like a Viking. This guy was about 140 pounds, 150 pounds in elementary school. I mean, I was only about 70 pounds, graduating grade 7, 70 or 80 pounds. And this guy was like a behemoth. I remember he picked up my brother by the head in grade 5, because this guy was in grade 6. He took my brother's head and picked him up like this off the ground and then dropped him. And this guy was the worst. Well, anyway, case in point, don't get lawn darted, don't hang around the wrong people. This guy used to love torturing things. I think he liked to torture animals a bit too. I'd hear these stories and stuff. I could never confirm them. But what he did was that he used to like playing with pellet guns and stuff, and him and his brother were playing in the house one day, and he shot his brother in the eye, and his brother almost lost his eye, had to do surgery and everything, and it was a big stressful event. And poor, Colin, that was his name. Colin, if you're watching this, I hope you've changed your ways, but Colin, he was really upset about it, and he obviously didn't want to shoot his brother in the eye, but it was just something that happened. And you think that would have changed the guy. You think he would have been a nicer kid, but no. All through grade 8, grade 9, grade 10, when I would be walking home from school, and like I said, this kid was big, right? Like grade 8, grade 9 especially, he would throw rocks that were like this size, and we used to have to walk down this large street, this hill. It'd have a couple lumps to it, but basically you're going downhill, right? So these rocks would bounce, and if they weren't perfectly round, they'd bounce one way or the other way. And Colin just used to love to see how close he could get to your head with that rock, right? So he would throw this rock and just delight in the fact that you'd start moving faster or start running to one side or another, right? So it was like a human shooting gallery, right? So you'd be there with your bags and stuff, my brother would be there, and all of a sudden rocks would come flying by my head, and then my friends too or whatever, and we're like, holy fuck, because this guy didn't seem to understand. I don't know how he survived the 80s, but he didn't seem to understand the law of repercussion. I would really be interested in seeing if he actually survived. And funny enough, his mom was a nurse, and that makes a lot of sense to me now, because this kid was a perpetual accident waiting to happen. He was causing them all over the place. But this is one example of a guy you couldn't hang out with. There were other people that I was naive with too and hung out with, and of course you'd go driving with them and they would take unbelievable risks, right? One guy would try to pass around blind turns during rainy days and stuff, and this was when we were teenagers, of course. And of course he had one series of car accidents after another, never seemed to learn. And of course to this day he's suffering some repercussions from accidents and stuff. And that was kind of the shitty part. When people think for themselves, not everybody's capable of thinking. But I'd rather that, honestly, than a whole world put in a security blanket and put in a prison, basically, and nobody's allowed to say anything or do anything, right? But you do have to learn or build discernment, and that was the best thing about the 80s. You had to learn what was risky and what wasn't. Now, on that note, BMX biking was what I did. I never raced formally, but all I ever did was build jumps with my brother and this other guy, Blake. And we'd go over these jumps and we'd see how far we can land, and we'd mark the spot and try to beat each other and stuff, right? And of course, sometimes you would overextend yourself, and then you would, have an accident or flip your bike or do something, bite onto your handlebars or smash your crotch on the on the neck of the bike, right? Or smash those shins on those pedals, because we all remember that. Every one of you guys from the 80s or early 90s or whatever, you all have trauma, and you can all remember what it felt like to have one of those bear tracks or those really good BMX pedals hit you in the shins. I mean, I remember like having scars and perpetual purple on my shins all the time from landing, and all of a sudden your foot slips off because it gets muddy or something like that, and then the pedals go zing, then whap, right in the shins. That was kind of what we did, right? It was all physical. You're always doing physical, so it only makes sense that bodybuilding or martial arts and stuff became more of an interest, as opposed to maybe some of the kids now who are playing everything electronically, and they can't stand to have even an argument in person with somebody without them having a poor little anxiety attack and needing medication or something, right? So it was a different time, but I think it was a better time in that way. But mostly what we did was we played adventures. We would also have to hunt your friends, You always had to hunt your friends. Like, you'd call their house, and most of the time, if you were in elementary school, like say you're 10 years old or something like that, most of the time, your friends weren't home. They were out playing, because outside was where you played, that you went to somebody's house or you did this or did that. So you weren't always sitting at home in front of the computer. Sometimes you'd be watching a TV show, but that was usually happening at night. You weren't necessarily watching TV during the day, although you might do that here and there, but it was just reruns at that point, right? So you'd be at night watching your TV shows like Knight Rider or Battlestar Galactica or you know, something cool like that. So yeah, so what you do is you call your friends, try to find out where they are, and you can't find them. Then it was outside and on the adventure of hunting them down. So it was like an Indiana Jones adventure, just trying to find your friends, whether they're at this one friend's house or at the other hangout, or whether they're at the tree fort back in the forest made, you know, again, this is another disclaimer, the tree fort was always made with stolen wood. Like kids would go into construction sites, steal the wood and the nails, and then they'd start hammering something together in the forest and claim it as their own. And if you trespassed in that tree fort, you were gonna be in shit, right? Because that was their tree fort, even though they stole the damn thing. So that was another funny thing about it, right? So kids were building shit all the time, or finding ways to, let's just say, have hideouts, and it was almost like they were playing grown up, but in a weird kid-like way, right? So I guess my point is, a lot of things were very physical. There was always this movement or this interaction that had to do with physicality and had to do with no supervision. You know, a lot of times there were kids having, you know, Roman candle fights or fights with fireworks, and or skateboarding down a hill, you know, and then falling down, getting a concussion or something like that. And they'd learn the hard way, but they would learn, and then they would make adjustments in what they were doing. Now, I have to credit my father and my mom, you know, for this. They were smart enough to understand the limitations of a child's wisdom, because there were some of my friends, or not really my friends, let's put it this way, they were the popular kids, and they were kids I was not a part of, or not in their cool group, right? This is as young as grade 6, grade 7. And they were getting motorcycles, like dirt bikes and stuff. And once in a while I'd see them in the dirt trails, because there was this massive dirt trail behind my house that we were using as a BMX track. And basically what it was an undeveloped area of land, which was filled with a bunch of hills of dirt, which had trees and grass on them. So it had been sitting there for years, like a long time. So the hills had slowly become BMX track trails where we could do jumps and stuff. But sometimes the kids would be able to get away with having their motorcycle back there or racing their motorbike around. And I'd have dreams about having a dirt bike. That's what I wanted. I wanted a dirt bike so bad, and I wanted to have this thing I could do massive jumps with and everything, right? And of course, my dad, being a policeman, had seen, you know, some of the major accidents that happened with some kids. Probably the same kids that had the same personality I did, where they would take risks sometimes with things and go beyond their limits. And ultimately he didn't ever get me a motorcycle, which was probably a key factor in saving my life, because I probably would have killed myself on that thing. But there were kids that had that, and they were racing motorbikes and stuff and doing all this sort of thing. And yeah, not everyone died from it, but I'm just saying, with my personality, there's a very strong possibility I would have gotten some serious injuries, right? Because just with a skateboard and a BMX, I had done enough damage to myself. I remember one year I was supposed to go to karate camp. There was this karate camp, and my brother and I were already signed up for it. We're going to go away for, it was like a week or something like that, or a weekend or whatever. Anyway, I was bored one day, because that's the other thing. There was a lot of boredom that happened those days, right? You know, a lot of times you couldn't reach your friends. A lot of times there was nothing to do. So you're like, go outside, and I had my skateboard, and I went back in the dirt trails, and I was just going for a bit of a walk, and I realized, hey, this dirt's pretty smooth, this dirt trail, you know, why not roll down it like concrete? Why not? It's kind of, use it like a blast ramp, right? Where you just drop in. And I've never dropped in on a blast ramp either. So that was my big mistake there. And the first thing I did was like, oh, I'll be safe. I'll go down this just on my ass. I'll just roll down this hill on the skateboard and it'll be fine. So I rolled down, and of course it was a thin banana board, and I fell off the side and then scraped my ass on the ground. So I'm like, oh, that hurts. So of course I'm going to do the next logical thing and go down on my feet to prevent from scraping my ass. So I went down, the board slipped out from under me. I smashed my hand on the ground, broke my wrist in half, and wandered home with a wrist all bent in an L shape. And when I got home, off to the hospital I went, and there was no karate camp for me. And I spent the rest of the summer hitting golf balls with one arm. And I actually ended up getting pretty good by doing one-arm golf. So I was doing one-arm golf, by having these golf balls and hitting it with a 5-iron or 7-iron across the field, right? So that was how I spent that summer. Another summer I learned how to juggle, because I was bored, because you couldn't get a hold of your friends. Sometimes they were with their dad or their mom, depending if they had their parents were broken up or divorced or something like that. And the friend that you hung out with most of the time was gone, out of town. So you're like, okay, now what do I do? So you sit there and you just learn something. So I had 3 golf balls, and I learned how to juggle. And I learned all these different tricks and stuff, and this is what I did. So yeah, it was a different time. There was like, You had to self-entertain. And I think the main gift of the whole thing was that you learned how to be, and you learned how to be with yourself, not necessarily always be perceived by an audience or told what to do. You had to learn what was right in a lot of cases. Sometimes you would get punished afterwards if you did something wrong, but you basically had to learn how life went. So yeah, that was basically what it was like growing up in the 80s. It was perpetual physicality. There was a lot of BMX racing, a lot of hide and seek, a lot of games, a lot of stuff. I remember my brother playing hide and seek once, and he jumped through a freaking garage door window because he didn't see, because it was nighttime. And then he went to go jump and hide in this garage, and he actually smashed his head into the window and went right through the window. Stuff like that always happened. Every week or two there was something like that going on. But yeah, it was more fun. That's what I could say. It's more fun. Mountain. I hope these stories entertain you in some way. And I'll talk to you next time. Chocolate.